I'd like to next introduce another amazing person. This is Dr. Maya Shankar, and she might not like me calling her doctor either, but I really want to give these women credit. It's not easy to get a PhD. And what she has done is amazing. She served in the White House for 4 years under President Obama, and she was there and she founded the chair of the White House first ever behavioral science team. I think we all know we're in desperate need of that again. Did I say that out loud? Sorry. No politics allowed. But what is a behavioral science team, you ask? Well, it's a team of scientists that are trying to improve public policy using research about human behavior. I think we should say it again, but you know what it is. She also served as the first ever behavioral science advisor in the United Nations under Ban Ki-moon. So how does one get to where she is today? Maya is a graduate of Juilliard. Just so you know, she's a premier concert violinist for over 15 years. After she left Juilliard, she got her BA from Yale in cognitive science. And then if that wasn't enough, she had the dubious honor of getting her PhD at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. And then finally, because her list wasn't big enough, she got her postdoc in cognitive neuroscience at Stanford. I think we're all feeling a little intimidated now, and that's just fine. But she's so humble too. How can you not want to learn from these ladies? They're amazing. She's been profiled in the New Yorker, featured in the New York Times, Scientific American, Forbes, NPR's All Things Considered. The list goes on, and with respect. Without further ado, I am pleased to introduce this afternoon's incredible keynote. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Welcome, Maya. It's an enormous pleasure to have you here. And one of the things I want to start off our conversation with is just sort of a reflection on the things that Mia was kind enough to say, but that I think are probably said about you all the time. You have this incredibly impressive background, and I think it's often the case that as an audience member listening to such an introduction, it can seem like your story was inevitable. You're just this phenomenal person, and all of this success was just going to happen, and it's just sort of us to
It was inevitable for Barbara.
Yeah, right, but that's always how it seems. Yeah. The question is that how it felt for you?
Yeah, I think it's easy when you hear other people's bios to think that somehow the path unfolded effortlessly and seamlessly, and they always had a plan, and they always knew what was going to come next. But in my experience, that was not at all the case. My journey was filled with a lot of challenges and confusion and anxiety and stress and many different twists and turns. And I think, again, the bio is kind of like the highlights reel, right? You just see like all the best parts, but you don't actually pull back the curtain and see all the nuance behind it. But I mean, there's a reason that I went from so many different things to other different things, right? Life intervened at various points and forced me to change paths.
Can you tell us a little bit about those sort of steps, like how you started out and how all of the twists and turns took you down the path?
Yeah, definitely. So I started studying violin when I was 6. Very, very passionate about it from an early age. And my big dream was to go to Juilliard. So that was like the pinnacle for me. And at the time, I didn't really know how that was going to happen because we had no connections in the classical music world, right? Both my parents worked at the university. My siblings played music, but they were more interested in sports and things like that. And we'd been told, at the time I was studying with a local teacher who had never taught anybody else but me, so he was kind of making it up as he went along. And my mom and I had heard that sometimes teachers at Juilliard were willing to take on students over the summer, basically put them through a boot camp to help them prepare for the big audition in the fall. And like I said, we had no contacts, so my mom kind of instilled in me this fearlessness, this go-getter attitude, because we were in New York one day for a totally different reason, and we were within walking distance of Juilliard. And she tells me, why don't we just go in there? What's the worst thing that can happen? We'll just see who's there. It's a crazy idea, right? So we walk in, my mom strikes up a conversation with someone in the elevator, happened to be a fellow student, very quickly becomes friends with this person, we're still friends, and asks her, hey, would you mind if you introduced your teacher to my daughter? And the student was very nice and said, sure, yeah, at the end of my lesson, I'm happy to do that. And then my mom goes to the teacher, oh, and would you mind if my daughter auditions for you in the next 10 minutes. I was totally unprepared, by the way, to see whether she could maybe be a summer student for you. So I pull out my violin, very anxiously play for this person that I just met 2 minutes ago. And he was so gracious. He took me on as a summer student, and it was the most amazing boot camp that I've ever been in. And certainly without that preparation, I think there's no way I would have actually made it in the door. In fact, I can verify this because my teacher later told my mom that when he first heard me play, he was sure I had no chance of actually getting in. And so I think, so that was how my journey began. It was just through my mom's fearlessness that I even was able to get in the door at a place like Juilliard. And so that became, for the next 12 years, really the focal point of my life. I was singularly focused on violin each and every day. And things turned very serious when I was in high school, and I had the remarkable opportunity to audition for Itzhak Perlman, who ended up taking me on as a private student. So now I lived in Connecticut. The weekly trips to New York were 3 or 4 times a week. And I was like, okay, this is my thing. I think I actually want to try to be a solo violinist as my profession. And then life took a pretty unfortunate turn. I was at a music camp, and I had woken up early in the morning. It was kind of cold. I didn't really warm up properly. I was an impatient teenager who warms up properly. And I overextended my finger on one note. And I heard this popping sound, and I felt like something had gone very wrong. And over the next several months, it became clear that this might actually be a career-ending injury. And then I got even worse news. I was told that I actually had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune disorder that is systemic. And so as you can imagine, now the problems are much bigger because sure, I've lost my passion, but I'm told that I have this lifelong condition. So I was immediately put on immunosuppressant drugs and anti-inflammatories and was told, okay, look, sorry, like dead end in terms of the violin career. So now I have, and by the way, follow up 7 years later, turns out that was a misdiagnosis. JK, Maya, you weren't supposed to be on all that stuff all that time. And I had a little bit of a violin comeback year, but whatever. Anyway, not resentful at all towards the medical system that I engaged with. So that summer, I'm like feeling pretty mopey because I was just about to go to college. And I think like many of you in this room, I'm thinking, wait, that was like my thing. That was the thing that got me to college. Now I have super imposter syndrome. I don't even feel like I belong anymore at college. And I was pretty concerned that I lost my little special spark at Yale, right? I'd even applied there because it was so close to New York. I was hoping to continue pursuing my violin career. So that summer I was helping my parents clean out their basement, and I discovered this book called The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker. And that was another one of those big turning points in my life because I opened the book and I started reading about the remarkable capacity that we all have to both comprehend and speak language. And I never thought about it before, right? I mean, this is like a pretty typical thing we all share. It's not like we're put in language boot camp when we're 3. We just somehow, in this really disorienting environment as children, hear multiple languages. We're not People, when they're speaking, aren't putting pauses in between every word to signal to a child where one word ends and the next one begins. We just speak in these continuous streams, and they're hearing broken words here and there, and somehow we all find a way to having language comprehension. And I just remember being blown away because I was thinking, this very simple trait that I've totally taken for granted is actually the result of really sophisticated cognitive machinery. Can you imagine what underlies things like mathematical processing or falling in love, right? These like really high level concepts. And so at that point, I was hooked and I thought, okay, I think I found potentially a new passion, and it's what led me into the field of cognitive science.
It's just, I mean, it's such a fascinating story, the way that you sort of follow one path really deeply, maybe more deeply than many people ever get a chance to do, and then sort of lose that and sort of swim in the uncertainty for a little while, but then get caught up again in something just as deep and just as complex. And it just makes me think, especially reflecting on so many of the talks that we have heard here today, I think there's often an impression that our success is determined by kind of what's in us, like what we were born with, and it's just kind of the flowering of that that is our success. And over and over and over again, I feel like we're hearing that really success is sort of what we discover for ourselves, what we create for ourselves. It's kind of us in interaction with the environments that we can move into. And so that means that there's really endless possibility, even if you lose things along the way. You always can create more. So I'm interested in sort of what you created then shifting into the academic space. How was that?
Yeah, so when I entered undergrad, I'd heard that, well, first of all, it was one of the schools at the time that had a cognitive science program. So I was very fortunate because what I was allowed to do in those 4 years was study the mind through an interdisciplinary lens. So you take classes in neuroscience and psychology and philosophy and anthropology and your computer science. You're getting all these different perspectives and you're asking these questions about the mind. And I remember hearing that there was a monkey lab that was designed for juniors and seniors who wanted to actually conduct novel research and write senior theses. Mm-hmm. And on day one of college, I was like, dude, there's a monkey lab here. I got to get in on that, right? But it was not meant for freshmen. And so I thought to myself, okay, look, what's the worst thing that can happen? I'll just be turned away from this class. It's no big deal. But why should I wait to do the most fun part of being in a research field, which is to actually get to ask novel questions and generate those insights yourself? And so I still remember I show up on day one. The room is packed. Okay, it's like 70 people in the room, and there's 15 spots. And of course, priority is going to be given to the more senior people in the room. But I decide that I am going to crush this application process. So it's a one-page form. I think my application was about 5 pages. And I offer this professor everything. I tell her, I'm willing to do the 6 a.m. shifts on Saturday mornings in the dead of winter in New Haven. You can have my firstborn children. I will elect to give you everything good that happens in my life. Please just give me, the freshmen, a chance at taking this non-human primate research class. And amazingly enough, Lori Santos, who was my mentor at the time, you might hear, she's now a celebrity. She does happiness research, so she's all over the place. But Lori gave me a chance. And she welcomed me into that lab. I was the only freshman. And it really changed the trajectory of my academic life because it allowed me to start doing what a graduate student would be able to do, which is actually run research, right? So over those 4 years, I was steeped not just in an education of cognitive science, but actually what it would mean to be a researcher. And that's what got me so excited about eventually going to graduate school and then eventually doing a postdoc. Yeah. But as you know, then it changed a little bit.
And it changed again, which I think is, this recurring theme of kind of creating the opportunity that you wanted to see there, and whether it's the impatience of a freshman or like really in many, many stages of your life, that same kind of like, well, why wait to do the most fun thing? Why not? In fact, I'll tell you, this talk was supposed to be a slightly different thing. She was gonna come up and she was gonna give a speech, and then we sat and we're like, I think we just have more fun talking to one another.
Do the more
Why
fun
don't we
thing.
just do that? And so we did, like 10 minutes ago. We're like, we're just gonna change this into the format that we would have the most fun with, that we would most enjoy, and that we think is gonna be the most kind of enriching and revealing for everybody else. And I think that, if you take nothing else from all of the stories that you've heard, is that they're so different because the women who you've heard them from kept making those choices to just say, like, well, what's the thing I want to do? What's the way that I can kind of create a space in which I can sort of give the most and contribute the most? And it's amazing to see how many times you did that in a relatively short amount of time in your career. So I'll ask you to talk about a place actually where you did a lot of creating, not just sort of a job for yourself, but like a whole part of the government when you sort of left academia and then moved to the White House.
Yeah, that was the biggest test for me. So I'm in this postdoc, and of course, don't forget, at every phase in my life, I'm thinking, now I can sit back, I figured it out, right? It's like as a violinist, now I figured it out. As an academic, okay, now I'm like in this comfy place where everything's all set, right? Because I'm obviously a type A personality. I like for there to be a plan all the time. So I find myself in my postdoc, and I still remember this one day, I'm sitting in a dark fMRI lab. I'm scanning this dude's brain. I haven't even had a conversation with him, but I'm literally looking at his brain. It felt like the order of operations was wrong here. It should be the other direction. And I'm like, this is not the right profession for me, because I feel much more social and I want to be part of a team and I need this more dynamic environment. And I want to talk to the dude in the scanner, not just, do analyses of the imaging that comes out of these brain scans. And I was really concerned at this point because I invested so much at that point, right? I'd now been studying cognitive science for about 15 years. And so I didn't know what could come next. And for someone, Heather, you're familiar because you're in a similar field, the options were sparse at the time. So I had basically two options. One was you can try to find your way into maybe a UX role in industry, or you become an academic. And those were the only two paths. And this is where I was very fortunate to have built that early relationship with Lori, because I reached out to her at this point and I said, look, I don't know what to do next. I know that it shouldn't be academia. I'm trying to force this and it's not working for me. Can we just chat about ideas? And she said, you know what? I think I have at least something interesting for you to noodle on. There's no job, but let me just tell you this anecdote. So she proceeds to tell me about how she went to a conference and she heard a talk by a professor named Cass Sunstein, who had previously worked in the Obama White House, is this huge luminary in the field. He's a Harvard law professor. He writes papers faster than I can read. Like, the guy's a genius. And he and his colleagues at the US Department of Agriculture had worked on this really amazing project to help low-income kids get access to free or reduced price lunches at school. So here was the problem. The government offered this program, but what they found is that millions of kids were still going hungry each and every day at school, despite the fact that the program existed. And when they pulled back the curtain a bit to try to figure out why it was that that was the case, a behavioral analysis revealed a few factors. First was that the form was extremely burdensome, okay? These are parents who are already strapped for time and resources. You're asking them to fill out a 20-page document, let's say. You have to reference old tax documents. Yeah. It's very challenging, and it was preventing a lot of families from taking advantage of the program. And there was also a stigma associated with actively signing up your kid for a public benefits program. Later, when I was at the White House, I got to talk to principals and parents about this. And so what Cass and his colleagues did is they found a way to leverage existing data the state was already collecting on these students, so their enrollment in other programs like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program or Medicaid, and they found a way to transfer that data and automatically populate this form, such that overnight, the default changed from an opt-in program to an opt-out program. Now, if you're eligible, you're automatically enrolled, and you actually have to take active steps to unenroll. Now, this is research rooted in our field, right? This is just basic behavioral economics research. And a light bulb just went off in my head, and I thought, oh man, that's the kind of work I want to be doing. I want to be taking the research that I've been learning about for the past many years and actually applying it to social problems to try to figure out if we can improve people's lives. Now, the challenge was, again, I found myself in a similar place when I was a violinist. I had no connections in the public policy world, right? And Lori was generous enough to give me Cass's email. So I sent him a cold email, and it reads something like this. Hey, Cass, I'm Maya, an unknown academic who's published nothing of significance that you would care about. Oh, and BT dubs, I have no public policy experience. However, I think it would be a terrific idea if you introduced me to some of your peers in the public policy space. And then I did like a decidedly female thing that I now regret, which is to say in the email, I know I'm not cool enough to work with the likes of Obama, but if there's someone in state or local government, please let me know so I can connect with them. Unfortunately, Cass just ignored that part of the email. And oh, by the way, my subject line was like, I'm always just trying to reference people that were well-known, so it's like, recommendation from Lori Santos, and then when I forwarded on Cass's email to a White House person, recommendation from Cass Sunstein, right, just trying to get people's attention. But Cass ignored that part of the email and writes back so generously, it's amazing how much people are willing to help you within 1 minute, saying, oh, sure, I'll just introduce you to President Obama's science advisor and his deputy director. I remember I was biking back from the pool, I had just gone for a swim, and I like nearly fell off my bike. I was like, what in God's name is going on? And I emailed them, and I now have an interview 2 days from then. And I have to now, there's no role, there's no job, right? I'm just gonna go in there and basically tell him, hey, I believe there should be a behavioral scientist in the White House. I believe that that person should be me. And that took a lot of confidence, right? Fake confidence probably at the time, but if you act the part, sometimes it just works itself out. So I went in and I was like, and that person should be Maya. We could talk about why that is later.
Turned out to be right.
And so then I go into government, and you would think the challenge is over when I'm able to get the job, but actually that's when the challenge began, because what I learned from my boss, who had actually served during the Clinton White House, left during Bush and come back during Obama, is that if you want to build things in government to survive, you can't really build them with its root in the White House. Yeah. You have to bake them into federal agencies, because that's the bread and butter of government. That's what keeps running, irrespective of leadership changes. And so what I realized is, okay, as a sole behavioral scientist, I can try and contribute as much as possible over these next few years. But what I really want to do is actually build out a new institution in government, build out a team of behavioral scientists who can work across the government, help on issues like veterans, retirement savings plans, helping low-income students apply to college and get access to financial aid, making sure that it's easy to understand student loans with the Department of Education, right? That space. And I can't tell you the number of times that I was told I couldn't do this. Yeah. And again, to echo Allie, like many times by men. Yeah. But really, I mean, people said, look, Maya, so many people who are way more powerful than you tried to do this. They weren't successful. And you need a few more. I remember one guy came to me and said, I think you need a few more gray hairs. And I was like, dude, they're coming in, okay? They're here. You just can't see them because I cover them up, all right? But that was really annoying. And I actually think I benefited a little bit from my naivete, because I didn't know how challenging it is actually at the time to get things done in government. I'm sure it's much more challenging right now, but it was still hard then. And I felt pretty uninhibited in terms of how ambitious I was going to try to be in this pursuit. So I had no mandate, I had no budget. And because, again, I didn't come in, and I wasn't commissioned to do this, like President Obama wasn't like, hey, Maya, you should start a behavioral science team. I actually had to earn credibility. I had to put myself on his map over my time in the White House. It led me to take a much more organic approach to building the team. And I think, my prior brain had thought, oh, if you want to get something done at the White House, you write a long policy proposal, and then someone really important somewhere just either decides to sign the dotted line or not, right? And that's not at all actually how, at least my experience worked. Yeah. It was instead knocking on every door I could possibly knock on, evangelizing the insights that I was bringing to bear on the policy challenges they were facing. It was trying to create safe spaces for experimentation, which is already a very novel concept. Yeah. It was trying to get quick wins on the board so that my peers in government felt like they were empowered to ask for more and to collaborate further with me. It was trying to convince outside partners. Yeah. Heather, you were one of them. Yeah. That's how Heather and I met, like the University of Chicago, to invest in my little startup team in government and to loan us experts from the outside world when I didn't have a budget to hire people internally. And it was very much a, startup in your parents' basement type of feel. But eventually, I think, again, because I was just earnest about what could happen, and I didn't take no for an answer, and I tried to build support in the most organic way possible. We actually had an effort that succeeded.
I think that's exactly right. You were sort of earnest about what could happen, which is shocking in light of the fact that you sort of didn't know you could do what you set out to do, right? And that's, again, something that's been true in a lot of stages of your life. It's like, I think that this thing should happen. I think it would make the world a better place. No one's ever really done it before. So there's really no way for me to say, oh, look at the track record, and you can be absolutely 100% sure this is all gonna work. But the decision to say, well, it should happen. It seems there's no good reason for it not to happen, and I wanna work on that. It was sufficient to just be and so I'm gonna go work on that. And for a while, the work is knocking on doors and sending emails and the building of the opportunity itself, and then diving into the opportunity to do that. But there's a bunch of really good behavioral science in just the reluctance people have to try out things that they can't prove with a long track record of success, that they are already qualified to do. And there's this sort of a gender difference in that women tend to be less comfortable kind of diving into that uncertain space and asking for people to trust than do men. And I think, yours is a great example of not letting that hinder you. And then there was another pivot. Even after, again, you sort of, all right, I built the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team. We've got all these incredibly distinguished academic partners. We're doing this groundbreaking work to make sure that research is actually changing people's lives. People are getting enrolled to college. People are getting food stamps when they wouldn't, like all of these things. And then the election of 2016. Yeah. Talk about what happened then.
Yeah, so that was an eventful year. I also got married that year, but it was eventful for other reasons. I unfortunately got married before the election. Actually, now I just remember that one of the wedding date venue options was the weekend of the election.
Oh,
really bad.
Mood killer,
yeah,
for sure.
So that was good. Anyway, so this was, again, another point where I'm like, okay, so I thought I had it together before, but now I finally feel like I'm hitting my stride. I have used the last 4 years to create runway. We now have a team. We have 50 people across the government now who are working on the translation of behavioral science to public policy. And I felt like a few of those years were proof of concept years, so our biggest, most grandiose ideas had not been realized. And I was like, and then there's gonna be Hillary. Yeah. And we're gonna have 8 years to knock the socks off everyone with our behavioral science ideas and really help improve people's lives. Yeah. Obviously, no one could have predicted what happened, but I was obviously really devastated. I was obviously devastated on a personal level first because whatever, my job, not that big a deal. I was obviously deeply concerned for the country. I was concerned for a lot of my fellow government colleagues who were civil servants and who would continue to serve well beyond the Obama White House. So there were a lot of things floating around in my brain, but I did know for sure that there was no way in hell I was sticking around. So I again had to pivot and shift gears. And it felt a little more, I gotta say, Heather, like it felt a little more comfortable this time.
Yeah.
Because I felt like my brain had just adapted to a better state of uncertainty all the time and fragility around the work that I was doing. I think, fortunately for me, the lessons that I learned through the previous experiences were when you're thinking about next steps, sometimes those next steps are just not going to be readily available in your environment, right? The path is not there, there's no path forward. And I took that approach again when it came to finding a job. Yeah. I just refused to kind of look at the cookie cutter profiles for my skill set. And I thought, okay, what's the next big thing that I want to do? And I had been in conversations with Google at that point. I'd spoken on a panel with one of the former SVPs there, and he had been interested in my skill set and my background. And so prior to that, I remember when talking to him, I was like, so flattered, obviously, by Google's interest, but I really want to keep working in public policy and working for Obama and maybe Hillary. And of course, you can imagine like November 9th or whatever comes around. I'm like, hey, just kidding. I totally wasn't playing hard to get, I promise. It's just that now I really do need you and your help. And again, I've met so many kind, gracious people. So even though actually in this case, his name is Laszlo, he was leaving Google at the time, he continued to mentor me and help figure out what my next step could be at Google. And again, another great example of Google knew that there could be a role for me, but they had no idea what it would look like or where it should even be, right? And so we entered this multi-month creative process, almost as a team, where I was trying to work with them to figure out, okay, where can my greatest value add be? If I were to replicate a behavioral science team and it could sit at Google, where should it be? What product should we be working on? How can we link this into your social justice initiatives? Yeah. And I came in and I thought, okay, everything's gonna be totally different this time because now we're in the tech sector and everything's super fast and well-funded. And I'm again told that I have no headcount and no budget to start off with. So the last 2 years have actually been quite similar to the first 2 years I had at the White House, which is again, having to build credibility for the approaches that I was bringing to bear, trying to get buy-in organically from senior leadership and people at all levels, everyone from the engineers who are actually coding the stuff to the product managers. But it's been a wonderful process to see unfold, and I think hopefully things will head in a good direction there.
Oh, I hope so too. I mean, been in these organizations that have such enormous impact. I mean, certainly in the White House, and Google in some ways has a bigger impact. But to know that somebody is inside creating sort of what needs to be created that has that kind of agility is enormously comforting, at least I think to me. I think it's also really comforting to realize just how locally you can solve the problem of what to do next, right? It's like, when you're trying to get into Juilliard, you're not thinking that, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line, you're going to be an academic and you're going to be in the White House, and you're going to be doing Google. It's like, I have some sense of a thing I want to do now, something I'm prepared to invest in now. And if I just kind of offer that to the world, maybe someone will be kind enough and open enough to give me a space to do that. And it turns out you found multiple people to do that. And that the same thing is true when you sort of got into academia. It's like, well, I'm a freshman, but I have this thing I want to do. I'm willing to invest myself in it. I'm going to offer that, and people will take the offer. And when I teach in executive education classrooms, and I teach especially like this sort of C-suite, the highest level executives and organizations, one thing I hear over and over and over again is that in some ways a lot of people expect too much of them. They're like, I can't solve all of the problems. I don't know what it is that you should be doing. So it's an enormous gift to me if you come to me and say, hey, here's something I'd like to do, or here's what I have been doing and kind of some ideas. And so really making yourself a proactive partner in creating that space that the organization will eventually sort of support and nurture you in. It's just such an amazing thing to realize both of those things can come together and be more available to people than are typically recognized. Thank you so much for coming to share your story.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you.